Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Future of Diplomacy Project seminar on communicating the UN at a time of polarization. I'm Erika Manouselis, and I have the pleasure of moderating this event with our distinguished guest speaker today. Melissa Fleming is the Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations, a position she has held since September 2019. Undersecretary General Fleming previously served 10 years at the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, as its head of global communications, and before that worked in senior communications roles for the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and Radio Free Europe. She's the author of the book, A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea, and the host of an award-winning UN podcast, Awake at Night. Thank you so much, Undersecretary General Fleming, for being here with us virtually today at the Harvard Kennedy School. And thank you also to Belfer's Senior Fellow, Jane Perlez, who helped make this event possible.
Thanks so much, Erika.
Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. I'd like to begin by asking you to describe what you do at the Department of Global Communications and what drew you to public service.
Okay, well, that's not an easy question to answer because it is kind of vast. But anyway, great to be here, and thanks for all of you for tuning in and your interest in the UN, and interest also in the specific angle that I'm going to talk about, and that is communicating the issues that the UN is trying to get out there, and also the work of the UN, which is, I think, quite vital, but in many places not well known enough. So my job is really to make sure that not just the work of the UN is communicated to the world, but also kind of the values of the UN. And increasingly, the values of the UN in this age, and this is the title of this talk, is the age of polarization. We're living through the COVID-19 pandemic. And yes, it's a health crisis, but it is a health crisis. And many of you are here in the US. It has, but it's not only in the US, it has polarized our societies to such an extreme for reasons that are sometimes a little bit unfathomable, but certainly it has a lot to do with how the pandemic has been communicated, and in the media age in which we live, where people who want broadcast a crazy conspiracy theory have a very simple method of doing so. They get on a social media platform, and incredibly, these people might have been somebody you'd see kind of ranting in Central Park with an audience of 5 before the social media age, and now they can attract thousands, if not millions, of visitors and have their crazy theories, travel across the world. So we're in, and the issue is that, and we'll get into this a little bit more, the institutions, the UN, public health institutions, governments haven't really equipped themselves to wage the kind of war that you need to be involved in on digital channels in order to get, to be present, even not to mention dominate with information in the interests of the public. And that's basically, I'll leave it with that. I mean, we are trying to be about information for the public good, information that embodies integrity, science, and facts, and to be that source for the world, so that they can feel trust, and trust is unfortunately very much eroding.
Thank you. I want to go back to your comment about communicating the values of the United Nations. How do you elicit sympathy and empathy in people who just don't share the same values or visions that you do? You once said that refugees are almost as sensitive as nuclear weapons, and they're a very politicized issue, which you were surprised to learn when you moved to your role at UNHCR. And though I personally found your TED Talks very moving, the way you brought to life the challenges these refugees faced as they left everything they'd ever known, had their dreams deferred. But some people in this country, in the United States and others, wouldn't agree with that vision. And I'm also thinking of Angela Merkel, who just stepped down after 16 years in power, and her decision to open Germany's borders to 1 million refugees. That decision, of course, led to the strengthening of the far right in her country, but it also secured her legacy as the de facto leader of the liberal international order. So back to my question, how do you convince people who don't agree with you about values?
I think that's a really good question, but I think that one thing is one has to accept is that we're never going to convince everybody, and that there are those who are so far to the extreme that it just, there's probably no communication technique that would work to turn them towards a different view. So I think that what we try to aim at is to speak to people who are hesitant, who are in the kind of conflicted middle, and talk to them in ways that they can identify with. I mean, one of the things that I really, as a communicator, try to avoid, it's really, really difficult, but to be somebody who is constantly communicating about the statistics of human suffering. When you speak about refugees, when you speak about, and we're going to talk about Afghanistan, when you speak about even the effects of climate change, terrible droughts that are happening, we're always talking about statistics, and their human social psychology tells us that even if you really, really, really want to care, and you're trying to care, if you're faced with a whole bunch of numbers that are supposed to represent human lives, it is almost impossible to feel something. A condition kind of sets in called psychic numbing. And so what we really try to do is to present individual stories that represent a larger problem. And that allows people to actually access that story, to relate to that story, and to feel something. And the other ingredient is to always show a bit of hope, because people are really tired of, even before the pandemic, we had evidence that pointed to people turning away from the news because there was so much gloom and doom being presented to them day in and day out, and it was just overwhelming. Now, with the pandemic, you can imagine it's even worse. So what we're trying to offer is not, you need to believe this, you need to do that, but actually to be kind of the source of information of the state of our world, but also the source of solutions for how we can make the world a better place. And people are responding to that. I mean, I don't think anybody wants people to have to die trying to flee a war or persecution, or to face a closed border. I don't think anybody truly wants people to suffer and live in extreme poverty and not be helped at all, or healthcare systems to leave people behind. I think when you can present to people, how would you feel and how would you be in this situation, I think they do respond, they do feel, they do care, and they will perhaps act.
I hope so too. In that same vein, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about your book that you wrote when you were head of communications and chief spokesperson at UNHCR. This was, of course, a time of compounding refugee crises around the world: Syria, Venezuela, Rohingya. How did you find the time to write the book, first of all? And then second of all, can you tell us more about Doa and her story and the reception that this story had at the height of the crisis? It sounds like the philosophy that you just explained to us is kind of all encompassed in this book and the process of writing the book. So if you could just give us an overview of that whole process and how you made stories move people to act in this instance.
Yeah, thanks, Erika. Well, if you can imagine, I don't know if you can remember the height of the refugee crisis in Europe. It was 2015. This was actually even before when I found Doa's story, and it was already, you know, more and more boats were arriving on the shores of Greece and in other parts of Europe and Italy. And, you know, I was already, as the chief communicator for UNHCR, every year we were reporting that there were like 10 million more refugees in the world. And it was just, the numbers were just, you know, just over, really, as I was just saying before, they were hard for people to grasp. The Syria war was driving so many people out of the country. And, you know, it was, the response was sympathetic, but it was starting to wane. And I knew that I really needed to tell these individual stories in order to reach people. And I read one morning in the kind of daily press review about a 19-year-old young woman from Syria, Doa al-Zamel, who had been rescued in the water. And when she was pulled out of that water, she had two little babies on her chest. And these were children who were not her own. And one of them survived. And I wanted to know what was the backstory here. What a story. 500 other people had drowned and died, all refugees. One of the worst shipwrecks in the Mediterranean Sea. And so I flew to Crete to go meet Doa. And when I learned about her story, I knew that this was going to be the story that would had the potential to really move the world. And also to educate people about the Syrian war and the refugee crisis. Because Doa comes from Dara, which is the city where the Syria war began. And she was just a simple girl, teenage girl, minding her own business when she started to see the tanks rolling into her street. And she was out there with her friends protesting. She was among the first families that fled. She fled to Egypt and was warmly welcomed by the Morsi regime. And then there was a change of regime and everything got, you know, turned bad again. So like all of these traumatic things that happened to refugees were happening to her. Very much a life of limbo, longing for her home, thinking it was only going to be temporary, that she was in exile, then falling in love, a love story with another refugee who was Bassem, who was convincing her, Doa, this is no life. You want to study, I want to work, showing her pictures on Facebook of his friends who had made it to Berlin and to Amsterdam and were studying in university. And she had had a near drowning experience as a young girl and was terrified of the water. She was also very suspicious of these smugglers who were showing them pictures of kind of, you know, luxury cruise liners that were going to kind of sail them across the Mediterranean and safely deliver them into Europe. But still, and the title of the book is called A Hope More Powerful Than the Sea. And that hope was more powerful, even though they got arrested twice trying to escape. They finally get on this boat and they're like shoulder to shoulder with 500 other refugees. And 4 days and 4 nights on the water, and a horrific experience, very mistreated by the people who were taking them there. Long story short, their boat gets rammed by a rival smuggler boat, and Doa gets thrust into the water, and Bassem finds her a child's floating ring, which is, you know, she's a very slight, petite young woman who has never really cared much about food. And that would be kind of her savior, because she could float on this child's floating ring. And there were people who were just letting themselves drown because they were hungry. They were thirsty. They were in despair. They just gave up. Her fiance, after 2 days and 2 nights in the water, just said, Doa, I'm really sorry, I can't survive. And he slipped into the water before her eyes. And one of the little babies that was entrusted to her, named Malik, was handed over to her by a Palestinian grandfather who said, Doa, please take this child. I just lost 27 members of my family I'm not going to survive. And so she took this child, and that child would also help her survive these 4 days and 4 nights on the water. And even during that time, another child, little Masa, who was 18 months old, was entrusted to her by her drowning parents. And so a merchant ship came by after these 4 and 5 days, and this ship radioed another ship that had already done a search and said to that captain, "Don't bother, they're all dead." And this captain said, I need to see for myself. And he put out the searchlights, and he let out a rescue boat, and they heard in the distance this faint cry, "Amma, Amma," oh God, in Arabic. But the wind was picking up, and they could barely locate where this voice was coming from. And it took them 2 days to find Doa, 4 hours to find Doa. And they pulled her up, and they tried everything to keep everyone alive. And a Greek helicopter came and picked them up. But unfortunately, the little Malik didn't pull through, but Masa did, and Doa did. And I wrote that story. I delivered it first as a TED Talk and saw how it resonated. And then the book is now in multiple languages, and it really has indeed moved people. And it's proven my formula. I think I have gone and spoken to, high school students in very kind of red states in America who read the book and had never met a refugee, had views about Muslims and refugees coming to the country from their parents and the media that their parents listened to. And all of a sudden, Doa was their hero. Can I meet her? How is she? They wanted to know everything about her. They wanted to know about the Syria war, why it drove people around. So they had an entry point into something so complex and so like, oh my God. And so for me, sorry for spending the time to tell you this, but I think I can describe the methodology, or I can tell you the story. And I decided to tell you the story because this is how it works. And I think if we're going to build bridges of empathy, we need to talk about the people who we're trying to help.
Thank you so much for telling that story to us now. I think it actually illustrates everything that you were saying. I'll speak for myself that I'm definitely captivated listening to you. So if you could talk more about your 3 W's and the methodology, I think our participants would appreciate hearing it. Okay.
Well, yeah, I have this vast job of, communicating for the UN. And I brought here to the United Nations a methodology that I was using also at UNHCR, which is very simple. If you study journalism, you learn the 5 W's of journalism. All of these W's, who, what, where, when, and why, need to be in a journalistic piece. Otherwise, it's not good journalism. And we use that for our kind of, we have a news operation, a media operation, a social media. We have, millions of followers on our social media platforms. So in a way, we're kind of a media operation in ourselves at the UN. But the difference is we are actually we're working for a cause. And so I've developed these, what I call the 3 W's of cause communications. And that is what, why care, and what now. And the what is that embodies the 5 W's, but it's really what the UN always does, that produces support reports that have all the statistics, that have the data. Look at our climate change, amazing reporting of the science of climate change. I mean, so important. We put these out as press releases. Sometimes we reduce them, to op-eds or 1-pagers. We do media interviews. But again, this is not, it is really not enough. And that's why I ask our teams to go through the exercise of the 2 other W's, the why care. The why care is figuring out, who do we need to communicate this to move the needle? Who needs to know this? How do they receive their information? And how am I going to get them to feel something? What kind of storytelling am I going to deploy so that they actually really do care? Once you get them to care, though, you better be ready to say, what now? What can I do? Or what is the UN doing? Or what is the UN saying, this is a solution that could help solve the problem. Here's how you can help. So this is the formula. And it's not as, it sounds easy, it's easier said than done, but I think we're making a lot of progress with it.
Thank you. So on this what now question, I'd like to turn to a current humanitarian crisis that we're facing in Afghanistan. UNHCR recently appealed to the international community for $374 million to support 3.5 million people displaced by conflict inside Afghanistan. In addition to UNHCR, the UN Special Political Mission UNAMA is still there after the US and NATO troop withdrawal. I understand that Rosemary DiCarlo, who's the Undersecretary General of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, just returned from a 3-day trip to Afghanistan, where she met with senior Taliban representatives. Can you describe the UN's current work in Afghanistan, the steps it is taking to protect women and girls, and how you think through the strategy for funding appeals, or what now, to member state donors, given the politicized situation?
Yeah, thanks, Erika, for that question. I mean, I think everybody was captivated by and appalled probably by the television images of what happened during the when everybody was evacuating from Kabul. The UN stayed, and the UN has thousands of people working on the ground. They already were there, and they've remained. And I think that this is something that makes me really proud to serve the UN. I've always said this, first to come, the last to leave. The UN is in the most difficult and often the most dangerous places on earth, and often the subject of attack. In Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation went from terrible to appalling overnight. A lot of this has to do with it being on the brink of economic collapse. I think we've seen the degree to which the international community was holding up the economy of Afghanistan. So many salaries were being paid. And in turn, these salaries were supporting families and were investing in businesses and keeping things going. When that left, what we're dealing with is actually half of the population not knowing where they're going to get their next meal. So I could throw a lot of statistics at you, but all I can say is it's really grim. We're worried about famine. We're building the biggest probably food delivery operation, WFP, and the World Food Program and the Food and Agricultural Organization are already hugely gearing up, not just to kind of give people food that will help them survive day in and day out, but also the agricultural support, because compounding all of this is drought, and then compounding all of this is also COVID. So it's a terrible situation. So we're there, we're doing our best. The security situation is somewhat better. It's allowing it, we do have access everywhere. So access isn't as much of a problem, which it is very often in these kinds of situations, as the funding. And we're appealing to our donors to make sure that the humanitarian situation is funded, but also development, because we can't keep a country alive just by providing humanitarian support. We need, the salaries to be paid, healthcare workers to be able to, go to work, teachers to be able to go to work. And finally, though, at the same time, we're there really insisting on values, and in particular, the rights of women and girls. Obviously we have to keep people alive, but we're not letting up on in all of our interactions with the government, with the Taliban, the de facto government, as we're calling it. We are insisting on women and girls being able to access school at all levels, to be able to go to work, to take part in the government. Unfortunately, we're not seeing hardly any progress there. Pockets of some girls going to school, but not a national decision. So it's a grave, grave situation.
Thank you for describing that. I'm sure we'll get more questions from the audience. Just a quick follow-up, and then I'll open the floor for anyone else. Reuters recently reported that the decision on whether to grant credentials to the Taliban for the UN General Assembly was deferred, along with Myanmar, and that the Taliban has nominated its spokesperson as Afghanistan's UN ambassador, while the current UN ambassador for Afghanistan, appointed by the former government, has asked to keep his position. So can you tell us about the reasons for the delay and how you expect this question of credentialing to be resolved? And is that somehow related to this values piece of protecting women and girls?
Well, I'm sure it's definitely, it's a member state process. So the Secretariat is separate from that, and they certainly have assessed the situation in both of those countries and made that determination. I wouldn't really want to speak for them any further, but I think that that there would have been a lot of outrage had it been a different decision. The demands of the UN Secretariat, as well as the Security Council, as well as most member states on upholding the values of the UN have not. There hasn't been much progress. We just saw Aung San Suu Kyi being arrested, being convicted and sentenced to 4 years in prison. So these kinds of moves are making things worse, also in terms of credibility.
Thank you for your honest answer. I'm going to open the floor now to anyone. Please raise your virtual hand and we will call on you. So first we have Alvaro Renedo, who used to be a fellow with our program. Alvaro.
Thank you very much, Erika. It's great to see you and so many good friends. Thank you very much, Undersecretary General, for sharing your experience and your wisdom. I'm a career Foreign Service officer from Spain, currently serving as ambassador in Albania. And I fully understand that communication is a strategic endeavor for diplomacy. And I've always felt, and I served previously as chief diplomatic advisor to the previous Spanish prime minister, that communication, that we diplomats have to be on occasions semioticians, if not by nature, at least by training. And I'm currently posted in Albania, and the whole Western Balkans region is characterized by a debate on the need to step up communication efforts by international society, international organisms, the EU, the UN, the United States, so as to underscore the importance of compliance with principles and values quintessentially linked to the UN system, but also to the EU, and foster the necessary reforms in the field, for example, of rule of law, human rights. And I would be really interested in hearing your views on communication vis-a-vis this region of strategic importance, not only for Europe, but for international society as a whole, and also for the UN. Thank you.
Oh, it's great. It's great to see you, Alvaro, and thanks for that. And I've spent a lot of time in Albania, way back when I was at the OSCE, and so it's I've been very grateful to the government of Albania for its role and help in receiving evacuated Afghans, in particular, many women at risk. And I know you've probably been very involved there. The Western Balkans has been, I think, kind of forgotten by the world. I don't think it's been forgotten by Europe, but it's not really as, on the radar screen. I think we've seen, though, really worrying news out of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The EU High Representative declaring his worry that backsliding could happen and a return to violence could be possible. What we're very concerned about is two things on the communication front in the Western Balkans, and that is, I think, more the problem than what you're, and I think what you're talking about is the solution. The spread of hate speech that is fueling division very dangerously, denial of genocide, glorification of war criminals. So this is a problem. There's also, I think, I'm not sure about the Albania context, but certainly in other parts of the Balkans, views of the UN that are problematic. So I really agree with you that we need to have, well, while fighting back and really understanding how this hateful language is traveling. It's not very different from another parts of the world on social media channels primarily, and really developing a strategy for how to address, or either maybe be to compete like we've been doing globally with our COVID-19 verified initiative, but also to ask the platforms to work with us on addressing the hate speech that is proliferating on their channels. And at the same time to elevate the content that is going to be unifying, the content that is representative of problem solving, of good public guidance, public health guidance, for example, or information that is in the public interest, that for the public good. And finally, I think looking at the media environment, I think this goes for the Western Balkans as it does for many other parts of the world, where you have the media that is public interest media weakened. You're going to have problems in having a robust democracy where trust in institutions, trust in governments prevails. So I think there needs to be much more investment in public interest media. I hope that helped. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Thank you.
Greetings to Tirana.
You mentioned verified, and I know participants should have received an article you just wrote in The Economist that talked a little bit about this initiative. And I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more for those of us on the call who didn't have a chance to read it. Can you just sort of outline the major points in the article and your success you found using social media platforms like TikTok, and how you see that as sort of a blueprint for further action?
Thanks, Erika. Yeah. When that pandemic hit, it was very clear to me that we were not just going to be facing a global public health crisis, but a communications crisis as well. I knew that we had a polluted media landscape as a backdrop, and that there were voices out there who would not like the kinds of public health measures that would be required to stop the pandemic. We also were very aware of existing anti-vaccine voices, as well as vaccine hesitant people. We didn't even know if there would be a vaccine at the beginning, but we were hopeful. So we realized we needed to really swing into action on the communications front, and to do things that the UN is not really traditionally accustomed to doing, which is being in those spaces online and competing where misinformation is spreading the fastest. And so we partnered with a social mobilization agency called Purpose, and we were able to get some funding for an initiative called Verified, which in the words of the Secretary General when he launched it was designed to flood the internet with science, solutions, and solidarity. So really, it compete where a lot of this conspiracy and misinformation has gone viral using the same methodology with truth and science. So we really penetrated the internet with memes, with GIFs, with training people, scientists to be TikTok stars, partnering with, created a content factory that we distributed to all of our offices around the world and asked them to adapt in local languages. And we got an array of media partners from, big satellite TV companies in Africa to radio stations, to entertainers, to comics, to really get to where people are and not just think that we could broadcast from New York headquarters of the UN and think people will listen. So yeah, it's been a really successful effort. But what we did say in the article that we wrote for The Economist is that we think that we're on to something, that this is a model that could be replicated also in the space of climate change. Those deniers are still out there and they've adapted, and they're even linked to some of the COVID-19 disinformation actors and movements, especially where they believe that, or they're trying to spread the notion that a global elite is coming to rule the world and using COVID as a pretext. They're saying just wait till climate, you have the climate lockdowns, and so we have a similar kind of pattern, some of the same actors, but not all, but a similar problem. And then similarly with the spread of hate speech. So we believe we have a model, but it's much bigger than what we are capable of right now. That's why we've put out there, if you're an institution, if you're a government, you need to also develop an infrastructure like this to be able to compete in this space. Those peddlers of conspiracy are very savvy about how to work the algorithms. The algorithms are designed exactly for the people who produce outrage. And, the UN is not there to produce outrage, it's to produce kind of the sober facts. So how can we compete there and get to people first?
I think a lot of us on this call who are staff at Harvard or work in communications at Harvard, also an institution that perpetuates facts and truth, veritas. I think we can take notes on what you're saying.
Absolutely. We need academic. What we've seen in the disinformation space is actually the study of disinformation and misinformation is growing. We have a lot more. I know at Harvard, you have very good people studying the phenomenon. And a number of universities across the world, there are fact-checking organizations. But what they're doing is studying the problem. And what we're trying to do is take that study of the problem a step further and insert ourselves as part of the solution.
That's awesome. Ping Wang.
Thanks, Erika, and thanks, Undersecretary Melissa, for being here. I'm a communications officer for the IMF for a while, and I'm also a current fellow of HKS. My question for you is, in recent years, the geopolitical tensions among big powers actually influenced a lot of the debates or the dynamics within the international organizations, including the one I'm working for, I'm sure within UN as well. So one of our mandates in the UN is to advocate for international cooperation, working together, collaboration. In my field, it's more international financial collaboration. So my question for you is, how hard do you think now we are communicating cooperation between member states than before? And how do you think we can continue our independence to champion for a collaborative approach as UN organization in the current political context? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a complex question, but it's important because, of course, the UN. On one hand, we say that we're the UN, we're an institution, but we are also, like, when we don't stop a war, it's not the UN that's not stopping a war, it's the member states or the Security Council that hasn't intervened. So they also, the member states also pay the bills. So we're often beholden in many ways. And so, but how to keep that separation, because we do have we have this document, the Charter of the United Nations, our Bible, the Human Rights Convention. We can use these incredibly important statutes to communicate who we are, what we stand for, and that we are a community of nations, and that we're fostering peace between nations. I mean, that's really our role, peace and cooperation. But we have no problem calling out when egregious things are happening or violations. But it's really tough to navigate, and I think it really depends on each situation. And that's, I hope I'm answering, but it's a broad problem. Of course, the IMF is more independent, right? I don't know how you consider yourself, but I think that would be a study in itself.
Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, hello, Ms. Fleming, pleasure meeting you again. I'm Stefan. I'm doing my doctoral research on branding at the United Nations. And so we've had the pleasure to speak a few years ago about that. And so it's good to see you again, and also make some observations in your talk now, and also the article that was shared with us on misinformation. And so my question is related to that. And so in the beginning of your talk, you made that observation that the work of the United Nations is very vital, but not known enough. That's on the one spectrum. And then we read in this article that some of the work that you do, like this Verified campaign, is actually unbranded.
Yeah.
Right. So what I'm observing here from the outside perspective, and I have another anecdote to that. I used to walk along 42nd Street in 2013 when the SDGs were en vogue or beginning to become en vogue, and you would see at the Pfizer headquarters, all these SDGs icons, but there was no mentioning of the United Nations. Right. So you have on the one hand the problem that the United Nations work is not known enough. On the other hand, you have some initiatives that project and portray and promote the work of the UN without the UN taking credit for it. And I'm curious how there seems to be a tension, and I'm curious how you navigate that tension in a way that the UN benefits from it, and in fact that in a way how you take those decisions so the UN can actually do what it's supposed to do, right? Whatever that may be in a given field. When is it a good idea to unbrand yourself, and when it's a good idea to actually claim credit for the things that you do?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Stefan. Really good to see you. And thank you also for the work that you're doing. And I'd love to hear at some point how you're progressing. And we're now about to roll out a brand book, a new brand book. So we're making progress on branding. Yes, it is a constant tension. The Verified initiative, I can tell you, it made a lot of people uncomfortable with it, because we're like, where's our logo on some of it? But I truly believe that in certain instances, it might be unhelpful if people are seeing front and center, oh, this is the United Nations telling me this, when it's a very sensitive behavioral kind of issue. We have no problem. We're always associated. If somebody takes the second step and looks down one layer, you'll see this is an initiative by the United Nations, but they're not getting that in your face UN branding. We think that this is the case that we would recommend for a number of institutions as well, because we're using this model of trusted messengers, and very often it's not an institution that people first and foremost trust, as we're seeing from opinion polling, but it is human beings, back to the humans, in people's communities, you know, and then, you know, through them, if they start to hear the messaging that we are asking them to convey to their followers, you know, then they can still say, you know, to a certain point, oh, I'm doing this with the United Nations. For example, we're now about to start a new, expand on our initiative of what we called information volunteers, of verified at first, our kind of digital first responders. And we're trying to scale this as verified champions around the world, where we will be asking hundreds, if not thousands of people to join forces with the United Nations Verified Initiative, to help spread our messages, and also to help people navigate the internet and understand misinformation. So they will have a clear association with the UN, but it's not you're to go out there and talk about what is the UN and what is the UN doing. So I think it's kind of, it's like even with our own personal relations, you know when to talk about yourself and know when to talk about the issue. I also honestly think some of the most effective communications, I've always had this tension, even in humanitarian, you know, do we talk about all of the things that we're delivering as the UN Refugee Agency, or do we talk about the people who are suffering? And then we come in and say, look, this is what we're doing, you know, and then, or we show images of the UN delivering, but this is not the centerpiece of the story, because people turn off if you talk about yourself all the time, you know. So, but anyway, it is, you're right to say there is a tension, it's complex. And I think it's the more strategic we get about our communication and our approach and knowing what we're trying to achieve, the better able we are to know when it is, okay, it's a good thing to say, this is a United Nations initiative, this is a United Nations report, this is a United Nations figure who is talking to you, or take a back seat.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Clark Merrifield. If you would like to ask it via video, feel free. If not, I can read it. Clark? Okay. I guess I'll read it then. How can US media do a better job educating people on humanitarian crises globally? So I guess building on what you were just saying, if it is helpful to think about it this way, what did you see in US media coverage of the Kabul evacuation that you think news outlets got wrong or could have done better?
I mean, I think there has been, because of the kind of charged political situation in the US, there's been just mass focus on what's happening in America over the past 5 years or more, at the expense of what's happening in the rest of the world. And it's just kind of where the attention of subscribers and, you know, the heat of the moment. I mean, if you look at, for example, we have been screaming as loud as we can about the need for vaccine equity, about the risk that if we don't vaccinate people in other parts of the world, at the same time as we're vaccinating ourselves in the richer world, we're going to see variants springing up, and we're never going to end this pandemic. I mean, I don't think that there was enough coverage. There was some coverage, but not enough coverage of this in order to build up that pressure where political forces would understand this. So it's very difficult to speak very generally about the US media environment, though, because it is also so, if you just take away cable news and some of the online, you know, I think that the New York Times, the Washington Post, the really good, you know, papers of record did cover the Afghanistan crisis very well. I'm worried that they all almost immediately evacuated their amazing journalists who were in Afghanistan for years covering the conflict, covering the situation. So, where there are US troops, there are journalists. Their lives were deemed to be at risk, including the stringers. And so they were taken out. So who is going to cover for the US media? I've seen a lot of journalists going back from the US, and that's been great. And there were some fabulous television journalists as well, who CNN and others who were there. But as in all conflicts, in all crises, it recedes to the back pages very quickly. This is not a new phenomenon. But yeah, I mean, where do you find news about Myanmar anymore? Where can you read about what's happening in Syria? What about Yemen? So it's a problem that has been building over many years, and starting with the dawning of the internet age and the advertising model for newspapers, causing a huge financial crisis in the mainstream media, and then the foreign correspondent being the first to go. I mean, you have some news organizations that will have like one correspondent for all of Africa. So we seriously have a problem in coverage of the rest of the world. I completely agree with you. This is where we at the UN feel also a big responsibility, because we are in many places that with no reporter in sight. And so, we have communications colleagues stationed in all of these places, and we're trying to get the news out. We're trying to deliver, and we deliver footage, we deliver news articles on UN News that actually can just be lifted. So we're trying to provide that service, but of course, we would need to do much, much more to really cover the world in a way that would be what these situations really need in terms of global attention.
Thank you. I'm thinking of one country in particular that has no American journalists. They were expelled two years ago, have not been back since. So on this big picture question from Rishabh Gupta, would you like to ask it virtually, or do you prefer that I read it? I'll give you a second. Okay.
If you could read it, that's better, because I'm facing a network issue.
Okay. So is there still a role for the UN in the present era of great power competition and the talk of a new Cold War? What are the challenges being faced by the UN in the present decade, and how will the UN tackle those challenges?
It depends on when you're saying what is the UN. I mean, the UN, obviously, some people ask what is the role of the Secretariat, the Secretary General, and certainly in this case, I think that he has an absolute, critical role. A lot of what he does, he's not credited for, because it's like being relentlessly on phone calls with foreign leaders and other people in power, and trying to get them to see the light, to lay down arms, to change course. So there's a huge effort going on, a conflict prevention effort and a peace building effort that is very difficult to communicate about because it's kind of invisible. It's so important. I wouldn't want to imagine the world without these efforts behind the scenes going on. We have, it's very obvious that the humanitarian work is absolutely critical for keeping people alive. The advocacy that we do for human rights of people, for the rights of refugees, for the rights of women and girls, for the rights of other marginalized groups or groups under attack, I think things would be much, much worse. We have a very divided Security Council right now, and that's causing a lot of paralysis and frustration. But I do think that the UN is needed more than ever.
So in the final few minutes, as you're talking about the paralysis, you host a podcast entitled Awake at Night, where you interview healthcare workers, humanitarians, human rights activists, peacekeepers in the UN system all over the world as they're working in the most difficult and dangerous places. So what keeps you awake at night? And do you have any advice for our students in areas of hope? So kind of a three-part question in these final few minutes.
Thanks for mentioning Awake at Night, because this is a podcast I started at UNHCR when I was traveling to war zones and refugee camps and finding my colleagues there, and like sitting in a bumpy car with one of them and hearing their life story, and just finding these amazing people who nobody knows, who dedicated their lives to better humanity, and really sacrificing their own safety, family life, normal life. So I decided it would be really interesting to interview them, not about the current situation, but about who they are, their life. And it really has taken off. It has become a very, it has like 3 million downloads, and a lot of people tune in. And for me, it's also a way to humanize the UN, an entry point into the UN that's not so institutional. It's the human beings who are working here, who are doing it not for the paycheck, but for the cause. And so that's, I guess, what keeps me awake at night is probably the disinformation, the misinformation that is upending our world, and it's causing so much confusion and leading so many people astray that I really just keep thinking about how can we do more? How can we do more? You had one more part to that question.
Hope or advice for the students?
I think, many of you, I don't think many of you are in the communications field, but just that how to just keep in mind how incredibly important communications is for everything that we do. I think communications is often seen as a kind of add-on or afterthought, but it's just so integral. And having communication skills yourself is also so critical, no matter, what profession you're in, being able to articulate powerfully, to engage in public speaking, and to communicate online and to navigate the internet. I think it's just such an important tool for having an impactful career.
That's a great way to end this discussion, which has been a master class in communications in itself, and in living your values and having the nuances that's required to do so, and the dedication to keep the work going. So I thank you so much for this incredible hour you've spent with us, and I hope to see you in Cambridge soon.
Thank you so much, Erika, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. It's been really great for me too.
Let's unmute and give her a round of applause if you're able.
Oh, how nice. I'm so sick of these online talks. Yeah, thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay.
And all the best.
Bye-bye.